this one, even though there was a large biface, a beautiful thin biface sitting on the surface, it took a little convincing for me to realize that this actually was a lodge structure. And you can see there's some wood here, and several of the students are leaning up against wood that is several hundred years old. And right about here, our excavation showed how it was set up Lincoln log style. Behind me, just a few meters, is another lodge that we called Lodge D. That was the first one we excavated there. At that time, didn't think that there would be anything in these lodges, and it was just kind of a project to keep the crew busy. But lo and behold, upon excavation, we recovered 6 kilograms, or about 13 pounds of debitage left over from the manufacture of large bifaces and arrowheads. And that was a real surprise. And after that, that's when we decided that this site had a lot of potential. And it was with that context that I asked Bryon to excavate a test unit right about here in this lodge. And that's where Bryon picks up the story.
So in 2007, after the 2006, after really recording these lodges and figuring out what we had here, we did this test unit in 2007, and it was only a 50 by 50 centimeter test unit, and in it we had found 300 artifacts. We found the logs, more logs to the actual crib log structure laying over the top of the artifacts. It really showed that it had collapsed inwards. And we decided that in 2008 we would really expand outwards and see what else this had in it. So in 2008 we came and did a formal excavation over the top of this lodge that incorporated all of the Aboriginally placed wood. And what we found was a much different picture on everything that Rich just talked about in Lodge D, and then some of the stuff we tested over on the east end of the site. We found only bifacial reduction in here. We found big stone cutting tools from 2 or more bifaces, but really just 2 main activities happening. And really not a lot of projectile points were found here while we were digging. And then we took it back in the lab, and what we found in 2008 back in the lab is that there was quite a bit of small fragments of projectile points, and there's enough bone to suggest that what appears to me, and we still have to formally analyze this one, is that they're butchering bighorn sheep inside of this one and picking out pieces of arrows that would have been lodged in the meat and throwing them into a surface burn hearth that was here. We dated that surface burn hearth. It has a date of about 160 years before present, plus or minus 40. So we got kind of the first glimpse that there was a lot of stuff. We had about 4,000 artifacts mapped in the end of 2008. No projectile points, none of the flint knapping that he talked about in this other lodge. We came back in 2009 and we discovered pottery. We discovered that there was a bunch of pottery that went up and out of this thing. And by that time, we had a pretty good handle of how these things sit over the top of these pads. And they seem to be kind of crescent shaped with an opening towards the northeast. And this one really fit that pattern. It doesn't have good hearth like the other one had, but it's got everything. We found the cribbing, like Rich talked about. What's really neat, on Hallie's feet here, we actually discovered the remnants of a leather bag that had been carrying ochre, and there had been big stone cutting tools inside that bag, and inside that bag they had been coated with ochre, and then it deteriorated or burned after the fact. We also found some bifaces, that really big stone cutting tools that were just left us gasping for oxygen. We're talking dinner plate size cutting tools. So there's some really interesting stuff in here. And in addition to that, the really interesting thing that I think about this lodge that's so much different than D and some of the stuff we tested over there is this one seems to be a real division of gendered space. This one has only the cutting tools and it has a bunch of ochre. I've made the comment to Rich many times that to me it looks like a doctor's waiting room, that there's crayons spread everywhere and just toys, and it really looks like there's women and children in here butchering and preparing bighorn sheep. Also back in the lab, I thought there was maybe something that happened after it had been left down, by some marmots because we found 2 mandibles of a marmot. Well, we put them under the microscope, and the marmot has been butchered across the detached point across the mandibles. So they actually butchered marmot, but there's nothing else left of the marmot in here. It's only mandibles. And that didn't make any sense to me for a while until we went to the White Mountains in California, and in those villages in California, the mandibles have been found in context with notchers that actually notch the little tri-notch points that we so often associate with the Shoshone. So this one, a lot can still be done in it, but the preliminary is that it's a lodge that's for butchering bighorn sheep.
Talk about the diameter of the pot.
Oh, so also the pottery we found it at about 11:30 on a day that Heath was coming to pick us up at noon, so we didn't have a lot of time, so that's why we came back in 2009, and we found one piece on the interior of the lodge itself, and everything else goes up towards where the students are sitting. And we thought it was going to be a real small flower pot shaped vessel, just pretty simple, but what we found out is we have one base and we have most of the rim, and it has a 33 centimeter diameter and a real low angle. It's a big, broad vessel. It's not a vessel that we've seen ethnographically.
Nope.
And it's a little bit different. So we've kind of talked around the campfire. Maybe it has something to do with feasting, or it's just a much different vessel up here. There's maybe a really social aspect to this site that has to do with food gathering and feasting, and we might have found that in this lodge.
Could you talk about what the pot was made out of, and then
Yes.
point out the perimeter of this lodge?
Okay.
The pot, luckily Bill Current of Current Archaeological Services in Rock Springs was very nice and generously thin sectioned and did a petrographic analysis of the clay in that pot, and it was locally made. And by locally made, I mean it was made in the mountains, which is really unusual. That suggests that the women up here had time and the inclination to make a pot, which is a several day process. So it's really something else, that people were up here comfortable enough to take the time to make a clay pot, to make soapstone bowls, and to have meals where you need a serving vessel that's a foot in diameter.
So the lodge, this lodge has been excavated, so what we have is a little bit expanded from what it was originally, but it's pretty much demarks what it was. This is the east wall here. This is the limit of the east wall. And then the original photos have another good piece that comes up this way, so we know that there was another thing that had fallen inwards. And then they're sitting on the west wall, and I can't, without tripping, get over there too much. The west wall is kind of over here, delimited by this, and then all of the wood incorporated that the students' backs are against is the limit of the south side. And there's some speculation, but it looks like the north, and we have this through artifacts, are really in here. So what you're looking at is something that kind of comes in here, about a 3 meter diameter.
Yeah. Something pentagonal,
yeah,
essentially, but not a regular polygon, and a regular polygon that's slightly pentagonal.
Right. So one of the things that seems like this village is pointing out, and I don't know how well this was established before, but that there was a division of labor, and that different lodges were used for different things, and
that's what we're suggesting.
And was that suggested before, or was
Not really. This is one of the clearest examples of what's called gendered space that I've ever encountered in Wyoming.
That's actually a really interesting aspect of the site, because it kind of shows that in the site, coupled with the big vessels we're finding, the artifacts we're finding, the frequency of artifacts we're finding, each one of these lodges has on order of 5,000 artifacts inside of them. So what we're starting to see is there's something up in the mountains that people can park it. They can become kind of sedentary, and they can start doing the things that happen in more, I don't want to say advanced, but different societies that have become more sedentary.
Complex hunter-gatherers.
They're really approaching something that's becoming complex, and they're dividing tasks out.
and specializing in manufacturing. There's one lodge that contains nothing but manufactured arrowheads, a couple dozen of them, and there was a craft specialist there. Here, pottery. Other places, they're nothing but monos. So
You found toys in some places?
I believe we've got a toy arrowhead here. That's, you know, a really simply made arrowhead made from a flake. It's usually curved. It's not so you can shoot around trees, but it's just a toy arrowhead there.
There are two bases. The only projectile points that are represented here are two bases, and they've been completely reshaped and blunt. They've been broken and reshaped and blunt, which kind of indicates they were maybe not realistic, just practice toy arrows, something like that. They certainly weren't used for hunting.
Yeah.
And I think that, coupled with the amount of ochre that's spread out and just the activities that are in here, kind of suggests that there are kids in here.